There's actually bird detection radar, and there's a couple different companies make it, and they can detect a flock of birds about 3 to 5 miles away. And the computer will automatically shut the turbine down if the flock is getting ready to fly into the turbine. So that can be deployed, and it has been deployed in offshore wind turbines already. They've also found that just simply painting one blade black.
I love that. It's the simplest thing, but it works well.
It's been shown in onshore wind turbines to reduce the kill rate by about 70%, because you get kind of a strobing effect, and the birds can see that turbine much more, and they'll evade it. Final thing is, most of the seabirds, of which there are millions, of course, off the coast of California, most of them tend to stay pretty close to the surface, because that's where their food source is. And there's going to be a pretty big air gap between the bottom of the blade and the sea surface, typically about 100, 120 feet. So I think a lot of birds will be simply flying under the blades. The bottom line, as far as I'm concerned on this issue, is the Audubon Society has come out in strong support of offshore wind. And their rationale is, yes, they understand some birds are going to get killed by these turbines, but they see climate change as a bigger threat to birds than the wind turbines. They believe the offshore wind is an important part of the solution. So I was heartened by that part of it.
Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beccasphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. If you would like to stay up to date on one of the most important topics facing humanity, I highly suggest you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss every single time I post. Today, we are going to talk to Mike Clancy. Mike is a retired technical and scientific director at the Navy's Fleet Numerical Meteorology and Oceanography Center, also known as FENMOC. He is now part of his local citizens' climate lobby. So recently, Mike has been focused on educating the public on offshore wind technology and implementation. President Biden wants to have 30 gigawatts of energy coming from offshore wind farms by 2030. He's considering locations in both the East and West Coast, as well as the Gulf of Mexico. So far, he has had the Department of Interior auction off 2 sites. One of the locations that he's actually considering building offshore wind farms is quite near me. It's in Big Sur. So he's having the wind farms be off of Big Sur, and then the energy will flow a little further south into Morro Bay. I talked to Mike about different types of offshore wind turbines that might be deployed in different areas, and what are some of the different pros and cons of this form of energy generation. I did a little while ago do a video on offshore wind, but this chat is a little more specified towards Biden's plans. Sorry ahead of time for the very poor video quality on my part. Still working on how to improve the video quality for video chat content. Before we get started, this video is sponsored by Divine Consulting. Divine is a leading provider in atmospheric science, high performance computing, and cybersecurity for US government agencies. Divine provides the manpower, critical knowledge, and tools for agencies to effectively and efficiently pursue their missions. For more information about Divine Consulting and to learn about how you too could be of service to the government agencies, check out their website at divineco.com. That's DEVINECO.com. You must be a US citizen to apply. Thank you, Divine, for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the chat with Mike.
I am a huge fan of offshore wind in particular. I'm a complete nerd for it ever since I took a class in college where we talked about different forms of energy generation. And I learned about offshore wind and how amazing the potential is for it. And I just was like, wow, what an opportunity. So I guess, can you go ahead and basically explain why it's such a cool form of renewable energy?
The big advantage of offshore wind turbines is there's sort of 2 big advantages. One, the wind field offshore generally is more consistent than the wind on land. Generally, for any given meteorological situation, the winds are going to be stronger offshore, away from the frictional effect of the ground. Usually over land, you go through a diurnal cycle where it gets hot during the day, the ground heats up and the winds are kind of strong during the day. Then it cools down at night, the boundary layer becomes very stable, kind of cut off from the upper atmosphere. And so the winds tend to die out at night. So you have that daily or diurnal cycle in the winds over land, but you don't have that over the sea. There's very little variation in the sea surface temperature diurnally. And so the wind at night is pretty much like the wind during the day, and it's generally much more consistent and and also generally, stronger than the wind over the land. So that's one big advantage. The second big advantage is you can transport the turbines to the site by sea. And that's huge because you can make the blades much larger. There's a limit to how big you can make them. No one has figured out how to make the blades in more than one piece. If someone figured out how to make them in sections and put them together, that'd be a game changer, but they haven't been able to figure out how to do that. They undergo a lot of stress. Those blades are, they're so large that the tip is moving typically about 200 miles an hour. And there's a lot of centrifugal force on it going around. They weigh about 60 tons on these really big offshore wind turbines. They're far too large to transport on land. The turbines on land have kind of reached their maximum point at about 2.5 megawatts. And you just can't make the blades any bigger because you can't transport them on the highway. You just can't exit, you just can't do it. And so the land-based or onshore turbines have kind of maxed out at about 2.5 megawatts. That's kind of an industry standard now. But the sky is kind of the limit on offshore turbines because you can manufacture them right at the seaport. That's what they do. For example, at Saint-Nazaire, France, that's where the GE plant is. The factory is right there. And you open up the factory door and there's the ship right there. And they just roll it out onto the ship and they take it to where it needs to go. And bigger is better because the power of a wind turbine is directly proportional to the rotor swept area. So, think the rotor going around, there's that circle, and as the turbine gets bigger, the blades get bigger. Think about the area of that circle. Well, pi r squared is what we learned about the area of a circle, where in this case, the r is the blade length. So if you double the blade length, you get 2 squared or 4 times as much power out of that turbine. If you triple the blade length, you get 9 times as much power. It's even better than that because as the turbines are getting bigger, they're going higher into the atmosphere and the winds are generally increasing higher in the atmosphere.
I never thought about that part. It's just so interesting. Like it's actually playing with all the cool parts of the atmospheres, particularly over the ocean, which just lends itself to such an enormous amount of power.
Right. And one of the key parameters on any wind turbine is something called the capacity factor, usually in percent. And it's the ratio of the maximum power that the turbine can produce in optimum conditions to the long-term average. For onshore turbines, that's typically about 30 to 40%. But for offshore turbines, it's typically about 60%. So they're just much more efficient. A lot of that, of course, is the wind field is more consistent offshore, but also because they're bigger, they're reaching higher in the atmosphere, they're just more consistent. So you get better performance out of the offshore wind turbines.
Why hasn't offshore wind been utilized? Like what has been holding back offshore wind from being developed in the US?
That's a great question. I don't know. I really have the answer to it. The US certainly has been lagging behind. If you look at other countries, UK is number one. As of 2020, they had 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, and the US is in 13th place. And we have only 42 megawatts right now of operational offshore wind. It's off the East Coast. There's 2 wind farms there. What's held it back? Well, that's a good question. I mean, you could say some of it could be regulatory because, of course, the regulatory aspect comes into play. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which comes under the Department of the Interior, has to approve, leasing of it, and then ultimately approve for, licensing and all of that. So that may have been an issue with, the prior president was not a fan of wind power in general, and so I'm sure that held it back, for the last 4 years. But before that, I don't know. Maybe it's the fact that we have a lot of onshore resource available, and we've right now the U.S. has about in excess of 40 gigawatts of onshore wind. And maybe people felt, well, we should build out that onshore wind first. UK doesn't have that much land, so they're probably looking. Japan doesn't have that much land. We have a lot of land, and we got a lot of wind turbines in the Midwest, so that might be part of it. But as you know, the Biden administration is making a big push for offshore wind now, and they're going great guns. And their goal is 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And that's very achievable. And there's they're pushing for 7 major projects, 7 major wind farms. And you total that all up, it's actually more than 30 gigawatts. So I think they're really on track and they're pushing hard for it.
Wow. How many homes could 1 gigawatt power or 1 megawatt power?
I like to think in terms of megawatts. So 1 megawatt, which is 1 million watts, is 650 homes. So a gigawatt is 1,000 times that.
Wow.
So,
that's a lot. You said something about how much capacity overall the U.S. has along its coastlines.
The capacity, if you look at the actual capacity along all 3 coasts, and Department of Interior has studied that. As a practical matter, you're limited to about 50 miles offshore. Right. we have an EEZ which goes out 200 miles, and legally we could develop it out there. But as a practical matter, you want to keep them within about 50 miles from shore. If you look at that zone around the coast here, you find there's enough potential there to actually double the amount of electricity we have on the grid right now. We have about a half a terawatt. That's a trillion watts. Half a terawatt of electricity on the grid now. Out of the wind resource out there, we could extract about a terawatt, a trillion watts. So now I'm not sure. I don't think that's going to happen. And there would be issues of what's going to be the impact on fishing and so forth. I mean, there are issues here. But the fact of the matter, there is a lot of resource out there. There's a lot of resource out there, and if it's done smartly, it certainly can be safely and properly taken advantage of.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go ahead and start with the different forms of offshore wind, right? Because right now on the East Coast, one of the reasons why it started on the East Coast was because the East Coast drops off more gradually.
That's exactly right.
So they are able to do fixed wind farms.
That's right.
So that's one of the options, but floating wind farms is another option, which is why suddenly this coast is getting looked at. So can you explain the different forms of
that's a very good
anchorage
point. The East Coast has the broad continental shelf. Same thing in the Gulf of Mexico. In California, we drop off very fast. We have a very narrow continental shelf. So there are basically 2 different classes of floating wind farm, as you point out. There's the fixed bottom and then the floating. Fixed bottom are just embedded. Their towers are embedded into the bottom, and there are different sort of substructures there, but ultimately they're embedded into the bottom. And that only works down to about 60 meters depth. And most of the wind farms that are out there on the East Coast now are even shallower, like about 30 meters depth. That's not a player for the West Coast, because it's, the Morro Bay farm, which will be about 20 to 30 miles out, is going to be about 1,000 meters deep. It drops off so fast. So you can't do the fixed bottom. So you're led to floating wind farms. Now, they're in terms of the global wind power, only a pretty small fraction globally. I think it's only about 5% of wind power is offshore wind power. So it's already pretty low. Mm-hmm. But the vast majority of that is fixed bottom. The fraction that's floating is way small. So it's like a 0.1%. It's really, really down low.
It's a newer technology, right?
Yeah. The turbines themselves are pretty much the same. It's the substructure that's different. And there's sort of 3 different types of substructure for floating turbines. One is called tension leg platform. And I don't think that's going to come into very much of play. It's somewhat problematic because the turbine is actually unstable until it's moored in place. And I think there's a limit to how deep you can go with those as well. The advantage of tension leg platform is once you put it in place, it's right there. It's not going to move around. Mm-hmm. The other 2 forms are going to move around. They're anchored to the bottom, but they're floating. And they use like a catenary mooring, which is the lines come down and splay way out. And so there's something called the watch circle. As the winds change, the turbine actually drifts around, just like a buoy, like a moored buoy out there. And in the case of the Morro Bay farm, and a typical big wind farm, the turbines would be about a mile apart, and they would drift around, about a quarter of a mile, depending on the wind direction. So they move around. And there's sort of 2 different structures there. One is called the spar buoy. Spar buoy is just a straight cylinder, comes down really deep. The great thing about the spar buoy is it can take huge waves and huge winds if you were going to put a wind farm in the Gulf of Alaska, or you're going to put a wind farm in the Gulf of Mexico, where you expect it to be run over by a hurricane every couple of years, you're going to want to use that spar buoy because it can handle, the huge waves and the huge winds, no problem. The disadvantage of the spar buoy is it has a really deep draft, and you have to have a really deep port. If you're going to assemble it at the dockside, which is what you really want to do, you have to have a really deep draft port to, tow it out to the site. Most places that, the draft is too deep, they can't handle that. I don't think Port Hueneme, which is where I think Morro Bay will be staged out of, I don't think they can handle the spar buoy.
Right.
So the third design is called semi-submersible, and I'm almost certain that's what Morro Bay will use. Semi-submersible is a lot like a mini version of a floating oil rig. In fact, it's pretty much the same technology, pretty much the same design, but it's smaller. And there's actually kind of a nice thing about that. And that is, as we phase down fossil fuel use, start phasing out offshore oil development, the people who will be displaced from their jobs in the offshore oil business can immediately transition over to supporting offshore wind turbines, because it's the same technology, the same kind of skills you need to build a floating offshore oil platform, or the kind of skills you need and the infrastructure and so forth to build a semi-submersible floating wind turbine. So I think that's a good thing.
So let's talk about the different locations then that Biden is thinking about for his wind farms. There's the East Coast, right? So there's going to be some all the way up as far as New York, and then going down the Carolinas, right?
Yes. Up the New England states and the Mid-Atlantic states, I think, are the main area they're targeting. They have mentioned Gulf of Mexico. I don't know what the plans are for Gulf of Mexico, other than the fact they've mentioned Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
And on the West Coast, it's Morro Bay. It's Humboldt, off of Humboldt County, which is Northern California.
Yes.
Which would be similar to Morro Bay, but a little bit smaller. And they also have plans for Oregon. So I think they're talking about three pretty significant wind farms off the West Coast.
Yeah.
The goal is 30 gigawatts by 2030. Well, Morro Bay is going to actually be 5 gigawatts. That's 1/6 of, in terms of that's called the nameplate capacity. It'll actually produce about a little over 3 gigawatts, but it'll be significant. Assuming it's built out to the way it's scoped out now, it'll be a big, it'll be a significant part of Biden's overall plan.
And do you think that the East Coast will stick to fixed bottom, or do you think that they would consider floating? Because we'll get further into like some of the dissents for offshore winds, but one of them is the eyesore argument, right? So the benefit of floating is that you can put it further out, and then people don't have that as a complaint. Or another one would be marine mammal traffic and so on and so forth. So floating might have an advantage for that, but do you think that they would consider floating all the way over there, or do you think they would stick with fixed?
That's a great question. You're right. The view shed impact is a non-trivial issue, particularly in tourist areas, particularly in areas where a lot of wealthy people living, on the beach there, and they don't want to look out and see the wind turbines. They may consider that. If I did an offshore wind developing company, I think my first choice is going to be fixed bottom. It's probably cheaper, and it's probably easier to install and so forth.
Interesting. Well, since I kind of already started the dissent conversation, so there's what are some of the concerns that people have about offshore wind? Yeah,
I think the biggest and most valid concern is the impact on commercial fishing. What I always like to say is I have a great respect for fishermen, and it's really true. They put food on our table, and they pursue a very dangerous profession. So their voices need to be heard on this. And pretty much, when you put out a wind farm like this, a floating wind farm, you're going to have to ban commercial fishing in that entire area. Now, in the case of Morro Bay, it's 399 square miles. That's a pretty big chunk of ocean that commercial fishermen are going to have to give up. And the reason is there's so much line in the water. There's mooring line and there's electrical cables, and you just can't risk pulling a net through there,
Right.
So they're going to have to ban fishing there, and fishermen have come out against it. Not surprisingly, the California Federation of Fishermen's Associations, which represents all the fishermen's associations in the state, has come out against it. Not unlike what's happened on the East Coast, fishermen were opposed to the wind farms on the East Coast as well. The one silver lining I see here is that the wind farm area will effectively serve as a very large marine protected area.
I was just thinking the same thing. I was like, well, I bet the fish would like it.
We have a number of marine protected areas in California, but they're all really small. They're like a couple square miles or, adjacent to the coastline. This would be a large marine protected area out there, which hopefully would enhance the fish population around it. So it would kind of hopefully mitigate some of that loss of fishing ground there. So I'm just speculating because there's never been a case study done like this. This will be a brand new thing. But, that's a possibility. So that's the first concern. Second concern, I think, is going to be the effect on marine mammals, particularly whales and dolphins. People in California, including me, were very protective of whales. There are a lot of people who have very strong feelings about the safety and well-being of whales. And of course, we have the big gray whale migration down our coast.
Yeah.
The gray whale migration occurs well inshore of where this wind farm is going to be. Typically, the gray whales are staying within about 6 or 7 miles from shore. That's why we get to see them all the time. But it's inevitable that some whales are going to find themselves transiting this wind farm. It's just inevitable. And the question is, what will happen to them? Will there be a negative impact there? So, it's kind of three things you worry about. Well, what will they get entangled with the cables? Well, I don't think that's going to be a problem because the whales typically dive down to a maximum of about 750 feet. And where the cables kind of splay out and get complicated is down, around, about 1,500 feet or below. So I think, where the cable architecture gets complex, it's well below where the whales dive. Second thing you might worry about is sound.
Yes.
The turbines are going to emanate a little bit of sound because, as they're turning, there's vibration, there's machine noise, there's, ball bearings and things like that coming into play. And that noise is going to get transmitted down the tower and then out into the water column through the substructure. I've done a little bit of looking at that based on what's out there in the literature. And, the wind turbine noise is really pretty low. It's definitely noise, but it's pretty low. It's comparable to a submarine in terms of source level.
I was wondering also if it would be less or more than all the fishing boats that would be out there.
Yeah. Kind of comparable to a fishing trawler, much less noisy than a freighter, or a super tanker, which of course transit around there. Pretty comparable to the noises that whales make themselves, about at that same level, And the bottom line is, I don't think it's going to. I'm sure it's not going to harm the whales. I don't think it's even going to confuse the whales. It'll just be part of the soundscape they'll get used to. I don't think that's going to be a problem. And then finally, the third issue would be, well, you have these electrical cables that are transmitting an awful lot of electricity, very high voltage. What's going to be the impact there? These cables, they're big. They're up this big around, and they're heavily insulated. They're heavily armored around here. I'm not worried about electricity leaking out of the cables. That's not going to happen. However, it's alternating current, and as a result, there's a fluctuating magnetic field, and you can't really contain the magnetic field. So the magnetic field does leak out of the cable. And when you have a fluctuating magnetic field, that sets up a fluctuating electric field. And so there will be a fluctuating electric field outside of the cable because of this fluctuating magnetic field. And so there'll be some electricity outside the cable, but it's going to be exceedingly weak. If you were a diver and you swam up to that cable and you put your hand on it, you wouldn't feel anything. It's about 100,000 times less than the amount of electricity flowing in a flashlight, a typical handheld flashlight, 100,000 times more than that.
That's not much.
That's really low. Now, whales and dolphins are not electrosensitive, so I don't think they're going to experience any aspect of it, even if they come up very close to it. Elasmobranchs, that would be sharks, rays, and skates, they are electrosensitive, and they have been shown to react to these cables and other places. They typically show mild, attractive behavior. They'll come up and, kind of shake the cable out. It doesn't
Yeah.
harm them, but they do sense the electric field.
Interesting.
And they typically show mild attractive behavior. Whales and dolphins are sensitive to magnetic fields. The conventional thought is that whales, in fact, do use the Earth's magnetic field for navigation. They can sense the Earth's magnetic field. But the magnetic field produced by these cables, even if you're up within close to them 10 meters, is I don't know, a factor of 100 or so less than the Earth's magnetic field. So it's very weak.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's going to be confusing to the whales in any way. So
Okay.
so those are the issues the way I see them. I don't claim to be a whale expert, but I've looked around and tried to see what the whale advocacy groups are saying about this, and so far they've been silent on it. So we'll see how that plays out. The next issue is the impact on birds, and wind turbines kill birds. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't kill that many birds. Even the wind turbines on the onshore wind turbines.
Cats kill more birds.
Yeah, cats kill way more birds than turbines do. Even cell phone towers kill more birds than wind turbines do. Birds fly into cell phone towers, and there is technology to mitigate that. There's actually bird detection radar, and there's a couple different companies make it, and they can detect a flock of birds about 3 to 5 miles away. And the computer will automatically shut the turbine down if the flock is getting ready to fly into the turbine. So that can be deployed, and it has been deployed in offshore wind turbines already. They've also found that just simply painting one blade black.
I love that. It's the simplest thing, but it works well.
It's been shown in onshore wind turbines to reduce the kill rate by about 70%, because you get kind of a strobing effect, and the birds can see that turbine much more, and they'll evade it. Final thing is, most of the seabirds, of which there are millions, of course, off the coast of California, most of them tend to stay pretty close to the surface, because that's where their food source is. And there's going to be a pretty big air gap between the bottom of the blade and the sea surface, typically about 100, 120 feet. So I think a lot of birds will be simply flying under the blades. The bottom line, as far as I'm concerned on this issue, is the Audubon Society has come out in strong support of offshore wind. And their rationale is, yes, they understand some birds are going to get killed by these turbines, but they see climate change as a bigger threat to birds than the wind turbines. They believe the offshore wind is an important part of the solution. So I was heartened by that part of it. And then the final issue, I believe, is the impact on the view shed. Mm-hmm. And, that is something which, people take very seriously. And in fact, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management takes that seriously, and they did a study where they actually did some simulated views of what the turbines will look like from Big Sur. Well, on a good day, on a good clear day in the morning, when there's no glare off the ocean, you will be able to see them with the naked eye from Big Sur, from Julia Pfeiffer Burns Park, for example. But you're going to have to look really hard. They look like specks out on the horizon. You have to look really hard, but you can see them. On a hazy day, you won't see them. In the afternoon, and on a clear day, you won't see them. Too much glare off the ocean.
The lease sales for these offshore wind farms will be available by 2025. Is that correct?
Yes, I think they're trying to probably wrap them all up by 2025. Once an area has been approved by Department of Interior, then the next phase is the leasing phase. And I think that goes pretty quickly. What happens there is companies, bid to lease a chunk of ocean to put a wind farm out there. But the really hard part comes after the leasing, and that's the permitting phase. So just because you've won the lease doesn't mean you have a permit to go out there and build a wind farm. You have to then come forward with your design. And, the design has to spell out in, a fair amount of detail what you're going to do. How many turbines you're going to put out there, how big are they going to be, how they're going to be moored, how far apart, where the cable's going to come ashore, all that kind of thing. This is where the public has a say. Mm-hmm. There will be a public comment period, and this is where lawsuits will happen. People will sue and say, no, don't do this. It's going to destroy the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So, that the permitting phase can take up to 7 years. I'm making the optimistic assumption in my timeline that Morro Bay will happen in 4 years. That could be overly optimistic. But that's when the public weighs in and other government agencies weigh in. Although Department of the Interior has the lead on this, other affected agencies also come to the table. For example, NOAA. NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service. They worry about whales and the impact on marine life. They'll come to the table and say, "Hey, we have these concerns." Department of Defense may come to the table and say, "We don't want to. This could impact our ability to do training." Department of Energy will be a player. So a lot of people come to the table, including the general public, and have a say here. And that may cause the company that's won the lease to have to go back and redo their design. So there could be some back and forth there. Mm-hmm. That's the difficult phase. Once the permit is issued, then that's the green light for the companies to go out there and actually deploy the wind farm.
Yeah.
Which I think for a major wind farm is going to take about, for Morro Bay, for example, I think is going to take about 3 years to build out.
Speaking of Department of Defense, so one of the interesting conversation parts of the energy transition in general has to do with just increasing the national security of our energy systems.
Yeah.
How will offshore wind impact that?
One big advantage of a lot of these clean energy initiatives, both wind and solar, is they're very distributed. The Morro Bay project will produce about 1.5 times as much power as the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. But it's distributed over 400 miles, 400 square miles, roughly. Diablo Canyon is like, probably 1 square mile. It's right there. So you kind of have a single point of failure. You can attack that one spot and you can suddenly knock out, 3 gigawatts of power. It would take a lot of attacking to take down this wind farm. It's distributed. It's a distributed kind of system. So in that sense, it's kind of safer. On the other hand, it's sitting out there off our coast. It's actually outside of U.S. territorial waters, which extend out 12 miles. It's within our EEZ, but outside our territorial waters. And you could imagine that a bad actor could go out there and, do some damage. But again, the fact that it's so distributed, you've got a U.S. Coast Guard, you've got a U.S. Navy. I'm not too worried about that, being an issue. I think there is an advantage in the fact that the clean energy initiatives are very distributed. I mean, you use up a lot of land, you use up a lot of water, but on the other hand, you haven't concentrated all your eggs in one, single point of failure basket that could be subject to attack.
Yeah. And I would argue that fossil fuels also use a lot of land and a lot of water too.
Yeah, well, they do. That's true. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, not as much as clean energy would, but also clean energy doesn't cause oil spills.
That's true.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Are there any points so far that you would like to make sure gets covered having to do with offshore wind?
Well, I'm just really optimistic and enthusiastic about the way things are going right now. What I worry about is what are things going to be like if we have a different president who isn't supportive of this. It wouldn't be hard to put the brakes on, and we probably won't be far enough along by the time, if we have a new president in 2024, we probably won't be far enough along that things would be unstoppable. So I do worry about the political aspect of this.
Yeah, definitely.
And certainly there are going to be, like any big project, there's going to be people who are for it and people who are against it. And there's going to be a lot of interplay back and forth. We have a lot of momentum right now, both at the federal and state level, but the political winds can change. And, it typically, from start to finish, big projects like this, are going to typically take almost 10 years. And so that's potentially a couple of different administrations. So I do worry about that. What's going to be the political landscape, before this thing is completed.
Yeah, that's a very fair concern. I think about that a lot, and just having to do with the energy transition in general. We kind of need stable leadership that supports it for at least next 10 years. There
are some things that we really need to get going on. And one thing is we need to increase the capacity and resiliency of our electrical grid.
Yes.
By a factor of about 3. We need to crank it up by a factor of about 3 in terms of capacity, because we need to move to a future where we're moving to electric vehicles, and we're getting all the gasoline powered vehicles off the road. Industry is moving that way. I mean, all the major automakers have plans to go all electric, within 10 years or so. But that can't work unless we really build out the electrical grid. The electrical grid right now couldn't support that. We've got to at least double it. We really like to triple it. And then of course we got to build out all the electrical, charging infrastructure and all that. So we really need to get going on that now.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Okay.
I greatly appreciate it. And
thanks, Becky. I really enjoyed it. And I commend you for the work you're doing. I was very impressed when I looked at stuff on your channel. And so keep it up. Really good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I hope you found this interesting. Thank you, Mike, again, for taking the time to talk with me. Please consider checking out Mike's YouTube channel, which is linked in the description box below. And if you feel so inclined, check out your local Citizens Climate Lobby chapter. Before we go, I also want to mention that I was recently on a talk led by someone else. I went on a Twitch stream called A Difficult Truth, where I talked about climate change and like different climate solutions and stuff like that. So if you're on Twitch and you enjoy news coverage, which I'm guessing you do because you watch my channel, check them out because they're really, they do a good job covering different political and environmental news. And they also have a YouTube channel where they basically repost their videos that they originally put on Twitch. So I'll leave a link to the video that I did with them in the description below. Until next time, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news organizations. A big thank you to the people on Patreon who help me pay for my equipment and the many news organizations that make climate recap videos possible. A special shout out to the climate confident and courageous David H., FK, Norman Anal, Greg H., and Paul B. I greatly appreciate your support. If you would like to support the work I do, please check out my Patreon linked below, or you can make a one-time donation using a Buy Me a Coffee link. Or if you don't feel like giving any money at all, no worries. Just a simple like, subscribe, and a comment is absolutely amazing. It helps out a lot with the YouTube algorithm as well, and I always love to hear your amazing comments. Thank you for watching, and I will see y'all in the Beckosphere next time. Bye for now.